evening. Welcome to the International Affairs Forum. I'm Layla Halal. This is the second event in our season, Finding Solutions to Global Crises. We're really very thrilled to have with us this evening Ambassador Robert Blake. And I want to thank Stan Otto, a Foreign Service diplomat, former and current IAF board member, for making this evening possible. Vern Powell will be moderating tonight's session. Vern is also an IAF board member. He's president of the Great Lakes Trading Company, a locally based international importing hub. And also Vern is a founder of the Food Rescue Program of Northwest Michigan. A couple of housekeeping matters before we begin the discussion. We will be having a Q&A at the end of Ambassador's presentation. Please use your chat function. Submit your questions through the Zoom chat function. If you prefer, you can also email your questions to us at iaf@nmc.edu. Again, iaf@nmc.edu. Second housekeeping matter is that Ambassador Blake is joining us from the great state of Maine, where his internet service is reportedly a bit spotty. In the event that the ambassador drops off, we have a contingency plan, and we are confident that he will be rejoining us momentarily. So if that indeed happens, please stay with us, and we will resume the conversation shortly. So on that optimistic note, Vern, over to you.
Thank you, Layla, and good evening to all members and friends of NMC's International Affairs Forum. Tonight is IAF's second lecture of the 2020-21 season, and this evening we are honored to have with us Ambassador Robert Blake, who will be reflecting on his experiences as ambassador to Indonesia. Ambassador Blake had a truly distinguished career in the United States Department of State spanning 3 decades. In addition to Indonesia, he has served in Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria, Turkey, India, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka. From 2009 to 2013, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, for which he was awarded State's Distinguished Service Award. More recently, Ambassador Blake served as U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia from 2013 to 2016, where he focused on building stronger business relationships and cooperation to help Indonesia reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He is currently chairman of the U.S.-Indonesia Society and a board member of both the Asia Foundation and the Bhutan Foundation. Presently, Mr. Blake is a senior director of the international consulting firm McLarty Associates, where he leads their practice in Southeast Asia. The ambassador is a graduate of Harvard College with a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Ambassador Blake, I have been looking forward to your presentation all week. Welcome to our Traverse City community and to the IAF virtual stage.
Well, thank you, Vern. I really appreciate that kind introduction. And I got to say, I'm really happy to be with all of the IAF audience today. I wish I could be there in person. I was really looking forward to coming up to Michigan, but unfortunately, COVID-19 got in the way.
Welcome.
I'd like to just say a special thanks to my friend Stan Otto, who kindly arranged this. And Stan, as many of you know, was one of the great linguists of the Foreign Service, but also just a fabulous diplomat and a great guy. So I'm so happy that he's part of your organization, and I'm sure making a great contribution. So let me jump right in. Alex, if you could put on the first slide. Ronald Reagan used to joke that the most terrifying words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Well, I'm here tonight to tell you that those of us who are in the State Department remain very proud of the work that we did every day to advance American interests and help people around the world. So I'm going to answer that age-old question, just exactly what do diplomats do? No, we never did eat cucumber sandwiches at cocktail parties, at least not in my lifetime. But I hope that by the end of my talk tonight, all of you will come away with some understanding of the fact that the State Department and other US government agencies overseas are doing a lot to advance our national interests, and not just on traditional issues like expanding exports and investment, but also on the big global issues of the day, like climate change. And I hope that for all of the students who are joining us tonight, who might be interested in foreign affairs, I hope that you will seriously consider a career in the State Department as a Foreign Service officer. I really can honestly tell you that there's no better job anywhere if you want to both serve our country, but also make a daily difference in the lives of other people. And I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Since I'm going to focus my remarks on Indonesia, allow me to just make a very brief introduction of that country, a country that I like to say may be the most important country that most Americans know absolutely nothing about. So if we could go to the next slide. First, with a population of 265 million people, Indonesia has the fourth largest population in the world after China, India, and the United States. But more importantly, it's the world's largest Muslim majority democracy. And I think that simple statement gives very little sense of Indonesia's really extraordinary diversity. It has 1,300 ethnic groups, 6 major religions, countless folk religions, 300 different languages are spoken, and all of this in a country of 6,000 different inhabited islands, in a region that spans roughly the distance between Alaska and Florida. So a huge, huge country. Second, Indonesia is important in the United States because, of course, it's important economically. It has a $1 trillion economy. It's a member of the G20, the Group of 20. And of course, it's a growing market for US exports. And I think just as important, with about half of its population under the age of 30 and a middle class of roughly 75 million that is also growing rapidly, it's a country that's rapidly going to ascend the ranks of the world's largest economies. Some say that it will be the 4th largest by 2050. Third, Indonesia is the largest and most important country in ASEAN. So if we go to that next slide. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And today the 10 ASEAN nations collectively have a $2.6 trillion economy and a population of 625 million people. And they have now formed an ASEAN economic community, which is currently the 3rd largest economy in Asia after India and China, and of the 5th largest in the world. So again, a very important market for American goods and services. So with that introductory backdrop, let me jump into my experience in environmental diplomacy. And let me start with a story. As I was preparing to leave Washington to take up my duties as US ambassador to Indonesia, I was called up to the 7th floor of the State Department, where the Secretary of State has his office, to meet with Secretary John Kerry. Now, such meetings are normally the occasion for the Secretary to give departing ambassadors instructions on the issues that the Secretary believes that ambassadors should focus on in their upcoming assignment. So Secretary Kerry looked at the long list of topics that his staff had prepared for him, and he chuckled. He said, "I know that I'm supposed to talk to you about the importance of our work confronting China in the South China Sea, working with Indonesia to improve human rights and religious freedom, not only in Indonesia itself, but in Southeast Asia, helping US business to export more and get more contracts." But then Kerry laughed and he said that as far as he was concerned, there was really only one thing that he really wanted me to focus on. And that was to get Indonesia to do more to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and therefore contribute to global efforts to reduce climate change. He, of course, was already thinking ahead to the Paris climate talks. and wanted every country to do its part. Now, he freely admitted that he didn't have specific advice about how I should do this, but he expressed confidence that I'd be able to figure it out. So I said, yes, sir, and took my leave. When I got to Jakarta, I gathered together my staff from several different agencies, and I told them of the Secretary's instructions. And after a long discussion, we agreed that since then President Yudhoyono was in his last year of office and already a lame duck, it was very unlikely that the Indonesian government was going to take any bold initiatives to reduce climate change. We go to the next slide. At the time, Indonesia was the world's 5th largest contributor of greenhouse gases. This was mostly because of the extensive deforestation that had taken place over the last 25 years, so that Indonesia could grow palm oil, one of the world's most profitable and versatile oils, but also because Indonesia remained a very large producer and user of fossil fuels, particularly coal and oil. If we could go to the next slide. So we reasoned that it would be very difficult to achieve short-term gains by changing Indonesia's energy mix. And instead, we decided that our best bet would be to work with the largest private sector palm oil companies to convince them to pursue more sustainable practices and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At that point, all of my staff started to look at their shoes. And I asked, so what's wrong, guys? And one courageous person finally spoke up and said, well, Ambassador, we can do this, but the only way we're really going to be able to succeed is if you take the initiative to talk to the CEOs of all these big companies. All of us talking at lower levels is just not going to cut it. So I told them, I'm in. Let's get going. So our first step was to figure out what would be a sustainable palm oil policy that we could ask all of the palm oil companies to adopt that would have a measurable impact. And after studying some of the existing sustainability policies of the more forward-leaning companies, we came up with a fairly simple formulation. First, companies should all agree to stop clearing all primary forests, that is, forests that had never previously been cut before, and which therefore stored massive amounts of carbon. Second, they should agree to stop clearing all peat land. Indonesia has a lot of peat land, which also stores large amounts of carbon. Third, they should agree that any new planning that took place should take place on previously degraded, previously cleared land. And last, that they should, of course, try to improve the productivity of existing palm oil plantations. So before approaching all the companies, I called together all of the major environmental organizations who were working on palm oil in Indonesia. And these are all very familiar names to all of you. They were the big groups like Greenpeace, the World Resources Institute, the World Wildlife Fund, the Rainforest Action Network, as well as a range of Indonesian organizations. And I shared with them our plan and told them that I wanted to be sure that we had their support, both because I didn't want to hear them complaining after the fact, but also because they would be very important enforcers of the plan. And all of the groups were very happy, endorsed the plan, and said, of course, that they were ready to help. So that was great. The next important step was to find an Indonesian partner who could serve as the public face of this initiative. It was very important that this not be seen as an American initiative, but rather as an Indonesian effort that other Indonesians would be willing to support. Nationalism is growing in Indonesia, as it is in many middle-income countries, and many Indonesians do not want to be seen as bowing to pressure from foreigners, be they diplomats or others. So I had a good friend with the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce, which is known as Kadin, and I talked to her and I said, I think that Kadin would be a really ideal partner, because if we could get the largest palm oil companies on board, then Kadin could work through its network to persuade some of the medium-sized companies to join in as well. So when I approached Kadin, I was really delighted that they were eager to be partners in this. and be the public face of this effort. Now came the first hard part. We had to get the companies on board. So my first stop was to meet with the CEO of the largest palm oil company in the world, which is known as Wilmar. And Wilmar, we started with them not only because they were the largest, but because they had the best sustainability policy. So I got the CEO's email, and I sent him a very brief one-paragraph pitch. And within 15 minutes, he responded and said, "Great, let's meet." He invited me to lunch in Singapore. And since a lot of US companies that operate in Indonesia are based in Singapore, I figured I could kill two birds with one stone and schedule a separate meeting with all of them. So over lunch, I pitched my idea and I explained that why adopting our pledge would help Wilmar mitigate reputational risks, since many consumers in the United States and the European Union increasingly associated palm oil with deforestation and climate change. The CEO listened very carefully and responded that he'd been waiting for someone like us to come along and try to organize such an effort. And he said he'd be happy to be the first company to sign on, but he needed me to do all the legwork to get the other CEOs on board. And I told him I was happy to do that as long as I could use his name in marketing the idea. And he agreed to that. So over the next several months, I met with the CEOs of all the other largest palm oil companies operating in Indonesia. And I got to say, although some of them were less enthusiastic than others, they all understood that since their competitors had signed on to this initiative, they had no choice but to do so as well. Now came the second hard part, which was execution and implementation, and also some hard-won lessons for me. The companies really had two challenges. First, they had to make sure that their own practices were sustainable. But the harder part was to ensure that their suppliers, their supply chain, were also abiding by the terms of the pledge. And since all of the big palm oil companies run their own palm oil refineries, they had to ensure that all of the palm oil kernels that were brought in by farmers to their refineries not only had not been harvested from trees in illegally cleared areas. Now this turned out to be hard because it required very detailed mapping and research so they could really understand where the illegally cleared forests and plantations were, and then ensure what is called traceability. We knew that the big companies were taking this seriously when we began to hear of complaints from medium-sized producers who could not prove that their oil had not been harvested from illegal plantation. So that was actually a good sign. But as time progressed, it became clear that there were so many illegal plantations that they were starting to band together. And just as I was preparing to leave Jakarta at the end of my assignment, the 5 big company representatives came to see me. And they told me that many of their suppliers had banded together and filed suit against the 5 largest companies, alleging that they were engaged in, quote, cartel-like behavior, unquote. I told them that this should be easy to disprove since the companies were not in any way conspiring to fix prices. And they responded that, yes, that was true, but that they were very worried that the companies would seek to bribe the court system to get a judgment that would be favorable to them, after which the large companies could then be liable for millions or even tens of millions of dollars in damages. And the companies, unfortunately, were not willing to accept that risk. So they told me that they were disbanding the pledge as an organization, but that they would continue to abide by the principles that we'd agreed to. So I tell this story in some detail because I think it illustrates first the opportunities for creative environmental diplomacy, but also the perils of working in developing countries where institutions such as the courts cannot really be counted on to deliver impartial judgments that are not subject to influence or corruption of some sort. But I think the net judgment was that this was a good initiative. And again, indeed, the companies are still continuing to abide by these principles because it's in their interest to do so. They are worried about reputational risk, but there's less pressure on them now, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other initiative that we pursued to help Indonesia reduce its greenhouse gas emissions was to persuade them to adopt a more ambitious clean energy strategy. When I arrived, Indonesia was only deriving 6% of its energy needs from renewables, and most of that was from hydropower. So we decided to pursue a two-track approach. First was to talk to the government and persuade them to scale up their clean energy ambitions. So I just scheduled an appointment with the energy minister, and we had a very good conversation. I explained that the cost of solar and wind electricity was dropping dramatically, and that this presented a real opportunity for Indonesia to leverage those technologies to expand electricity availability for Indonesians living on many of Indonesia's 6,000 islands. Most of them, of course, were not connected by any sort of grid. I tried to frame the argument in economic development terms. Bringing in renewable electricity would have many benefits. First, it would enable Indonesia to dramatically scale back imports of expensive and carbon-intensive diesel fuel that was being used to fuel generators on most of these islands. And they would thereby save valuable foreign exchange. Second, replacing this diesel with solar or wind would help Indonesia meet its ambitious climate objectives. And third, having a dependable source of 24/7 power would mean that these islands would ensure electricity for cell phone and internet towers that in turn could enable education and new business opportunities for the populations of these islands. At that point, Indonesia's digital economy was just beginning to develop, and hundreds of small and medium-sized enterprises were coming online across the country to sell their products, mostly within Indonesia. So that argument had some resonance. The minister listened carefully, but I wasn't sure if I'd gotten through to him. So I gathered allies to make similar representations. The EU, Canada, Australia, and other countries, all of whom cared about climate change. I also had meetings with the influential Indonesian think tanks and non-governmental organizations and others, all of whom agreed to make their own representations. And last but not least, I contacted American companies. And I said, we really need you guys to bid on these big contracts now. And so we achieved a fairly early breakthrough when a US company called UPC Renewables won the first utility scale wind contract in Indonesia to build 30 huge wind turbines in one of the islands called South Sulawesi. So that was a big start. And then we worked a lot on the US solar companies as well. The good news is that all this had an impact. The government announced several months later that they would be pursuing a much more ambitious policy to increase the share of renewables from the current 6% to 23% by 2025. The bad news is that today Indonesia is not even halfway to that target. So they really need to redouble their efforts. And the trouble is that until quite recently, few countries were taking steps to really raise their climate ambitions. And on the contrary, I think the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord gave political space for many countries to quietly soften their own commitments. And we can come back to that in the Q&A if there's interest in that. So let me return to my own story. I decided to retire from the Foreign Service after leaving Indonesia, in part because I'd had a great 31-year career, but also because I judged that the election of President Trump would mean dramatic changes to the traditional foreign policy that the United States had pursued under Republican and Democratic presidents for more than 50 years. But I was still eager to do what I could as a private citizen to help encourage Indonesia to make climate and other environmental progress. So I went to see groups such as the World Resources Institute and the World Wildlife Fund and the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is the NGO arm of the New York's famous Bronx Zoo. And after talking to them, they thought I could help in probably two principal areas. First was to help boost efforts to save Indonesia's unique biodiversity, and I'll come back to that. And second was to help provide Indonesia with state-of-the-art advice about how it can achieve its objective to build a new green capital city in Indonesia's Borneo, which is called Kalimantan. So let me start with the biodiversity first, and let me start with another story about that. At the end of my first year as ambassador, representatives of the Wildlife Conservation Society came to see me. And they said, Ambassador, we hear you care a lot about environmental issues. We need your help. I said, sure, what can I do? So they said, okay, we need your help to get the government to accord greater protection to an area of the island of Sumatra that has some of the last remaining breeding populations of so-called charismatic species, like the Sumatran tiger, the Sumatran rhino, the Sumatran elephant, and of course, Sumatra's famous orangutans. So I said, look, I'll be glad to help, but I have two conditions. First, let's think more ambitiously. At the current rate of biodiversity loss, there's a real risk that all of these charismatic species are going to be gone in 20 years. So let's map out all of the areas of Sumatra that still have breeding populations of these species, and then let's figure it out if we need to buy more land to create wildlife corridors to link these various lands together. And I told them that I would take charge of presenting our proposal to the government, and I would even take the lead in identifying potential private Indonesian donors, because this had to be an effort, again, led by Indonesians and not by big donors living in Washington or London. My only condition was that since I represented all of the American conservation groups, this could not just be a Wildlife Conservation Society effort, but they needed to involve all the major groups that were interested in this. So I asked them to come together, get all of these groups together, do the mapping of what was needed to be done, and then we could get cracking. And that they had 2 years to do this until the end of my assignment. The sad end of this story is that they were never able to reach agreement among themselves. I think because they all really wanted to have fundraising credit for what they were doing. And so that was a rather disappointing outcome. But after I retired, I went back to WCS and I said, okay, let's take this up again. I'm now a private citizen and I can work with you pro bono to try to get this done. And let's try to reframe this in terms of Indonesia's role in the global biodiversity challenge. You have probably all heard the statistics. The world is now in the middle of an extinction crisis of our own making, namely due to a combination of things like habitat loss, pollution, overexploitation, invasive species, and of course, climate change. Scientists estimate that large numbers of species today are on the path to extinction. 14% of the world's birds, 25% of our mammals, 40% of amphibians, and the list goes on from there. So why does this matter to Indonesia? First, because Indonesia probably has the world's greatest combination of marine and terrestrial biodiversity, but also because that biodiversity is under tremendous threat from deforestation, poaching, illegal and overfishing, and some of the other causes that I talked about earlier. Now, every 10 years, all of the countries of the world gather together for something called the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a mouthful, but is actually something really important because they set every decade targets for protecting biodiversity. Next year's conference is going to be held in Kunming, China, which is important because China is financing a lot of projects that are leading to some of this deforestation. So all the major conservation organizations are looking ahead to Kunming, and they've agreed that the goal of that conference should be for all countries in the world to set aside by 2030, 30% of their land and or ocean in some form of protected area. So it could be parks, national forests, wildlife areas of whatever, marine protected areas. And they call it the 30 by 30 challenge. So they're hoping to get all governments to adopt this challenge. So my idea to WCS was to organize a conference with the Indonesian government and all of the major conservation organizations, the international development banks, and international businesses like Unilever and Mondelez, and have Indonesia be the model test case of what can be done to achieve 30 by 30. So prior to the conference, we would ask the Indonesians to work with experts to map out what would be Indonesia's targeted areas to meet the 30 by 30 goal. And then the purpose of the conference would be to take that map of the areas to be protected and then figure out what additional livelihood programs will be needed to support the people living in or on the edges of these areas to be protected. This so-called people-first approach is important because in countries like Indonesia, it's really poverty that drives habitat loss, poaching, and overfishing. And frankly, the populations there really don't care that much about endangered species. They care about their own livelihoods, providing for their families, which of course is perfectly understandable. So for each of these areas requiring additional protection, we need to figure out what livelihood projects already are underway and then where are the gaps and how they can be filled. So for example, maybe the World Wildlife can finance ecotourism projects for people to visit wild orangutans in Sumatra, or a new hotel somewhere on one of the islands in Papua to go and watch the whale sharks there. And businesses likewise can create projects like growing vanilla and cinnamon and all kinds of other commodities on the edges of the forests, and then using their marketing networks to get those products to market. Now, unfortunately, the coronavirus has sidetracked this, but I'm about to re-embark on this to approach one or more of the big conservation organizations to ask them to work with me to raise the money from a big foundation to sponsor this conference, and then we can get to work. So I'm really hopeful and excited about this challenge. Last and very briefly, and let's go to the next slide, I'd like to just talk very briefly about a third priority, which is how we can help Indonesia to meet its objectives to build a green capital city. Now, many of you know Jakarta is one of the world's mega cities. But because of sea level rise and subsidence due to overexploitation of the city's groundwater, Jakarta is gradually sinking. So every year, up to a quarter of the city is regularly underwater, as you see in those pictures. Given that burden and the fact that Greater Jakarta now numbers almost 30 million people, so second only to Greater Tokyo, Indonesia's president decided in his first term that it would be smart to build a new capital city in Kalimantan. So next slide. The whole project remains very, very controversial on several fronts. First, it'll be very, very expensive. And indeed, it's been delayed because of COVID-19 and the need to try to revive the economy there. But second, most people are not likely to move to central Kalimantan because it's going to take years for the new capital city to have the same kinds of amenities as Jakarta. The good news, though, is that the president wants the new capital to be a model green city, and planning is underway for that. So I want to be sure that the planning team gets the best advice possible. So, for example, they're reportedly planning to build large hydroelectric facilities to power the new city. But the experience of Brazil and others has shown that when dams that are built for hydropower flood large tracts of tropical forests and vegetation, the flooded vegetation gradually releases very large amounts of carbon as the vegetation decomposes, thereby completely undercutting the green objective of the project. So I've lined up some real experts from Cornell who have experience in Brazil to try to explain that dynamic. And of course, a far better idea for powering the city will be to rely on a combination of solar and smart city technologies. The International Energy Agency, which most of you have heard of, has just published its annual energy report. And among its very many interesting conclusions is that solar is now cheaper than coal or gas, and that over the next decade, renewables are going to account for 80% of new power generation, which is a pretty striking and encouraging development. So I've been in touch with US companies like First Solar, which is one of the largest American companies that is operating overseas. And they have said that they will be very happy to speak with the planners and also to compete for tenders. And secondly, since some of the financing for this new capital is going to come from the United Arab Emirates and their sovereign wealth fund, I have contacted firms, US firms, who have built state-of-the-art green cities in the UAE so that they can share the lessons they've learned and the technology they benefited from. And hopefully the UAE will help us to persuade the government to adopt some of these technologies. Lastly, there's a group called the Smart Surfaces Coalition that has done terrific work with cities around the world. And they promote technologies like reflective roofs, pavements, porous pavements, green roofs, and of course, extensive tree planting, all of which can substantially reduce energy demand and create more livable urban spaces. And they too are ready to engage with Indonesia. So once planning restarts after the COVID crisis, we're going to get to work on this. So let me conclude with just a thought for all of the young people in the audience. And that is, each of you can make a difference. One of the best secretaries of state that I worked for was Colin Powell. And Colin Powell knew a lot about leadership because he had grown up in the military. And he used to tell us three things. First, diplomacy is about listening to what the other guy needs. Of course, you have to preserve your own position, but you need to listen to the other guy. Second, every problem has a solution. You just have to figure out what that solution is. And third, and perhaps most important, optimism is a force multiplier. So always be positive, always have a positive outlook, and that's going to get you a lot of the way there. And I must say all of that advice has served me very well. And I think if you remember those, they're going to carry you very far as well. So again, thank you to IAEF for this really terrific opportunity. And Vern, I'd be happy to take any questions on anything that I've just talked about. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Blake, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure we all did. We have some questions for you. We'd like to go back to palm oil to begin with. We have a question from the audience first, from Robert Garvey, who asks, it seems logical that the 5 largest palm oil companies would join to stop small renegade growers. Was there an effort to encourage these small growers to grow something other than palm? Were they provided incentives?
The problem with that is that palm oil itself is A, very easy to grow, and B, very easy to sell and market. And so devising other kinds of things that they could grow is feasible, but not as easy as you might think. So I'll give you 2 examples of things that we did do. One was in Papua. Papua is sort of the latest place where people are very worried about rapid rates of deforestation. So through the Agency for International Development, we did 2 really great projects. One was to work with McCormick Spices, the famous Baltimore-based spice company that you see on your grocery shelves, and they agreed to provide advice to Papuan farmers about growing, particularly vanilla. Vanilla is a very expensive but valuable commodity and relatively easy to grow. And you can grow it in tropical forests. You don't have to cut anything down. And so they agreed to set up the marketing network in Papua so that McCormick would market vanilla that was grown by these farmers. That turned out to be a very successful project. Likewise, cinnamon, a very useful product. The other one that we did which was great, was cassava. Papua turned out to have a really fairly serious food deficit, and so we learned that it would be possible to grow cassava on some of these degraded lands. So we got very high yield cassava seeds from Thailand that were roughly yielded about 5 times what the normal Indonesian cassava was yielding. And that too turned out to be quite an important income earner for farmers. But again, those really couldn't compete in terms of the profits that the farmers were going to derive from palm oil. And that was the big challenge.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We have a related question, perhaps. Indonesia is an extremely diverse society with so many unique ethnic populations. Did any specific cultural norms or cues come into play as you interacted with or negotiated agreements with leaders of municipalities or government officials?
Not so much, because most of the palm oil was grown really in two major areas. One in Sumatra, one in Kalimantan, and again, they're mostly, there were many different ethnic groups, but what we tried to do, that may be a little bit surprising to some of you, was we tried to engage the indigenous groups. That is, the people that have been living in the forest for since time immemorial, because they had been living sustainably in the forest for years and years and years, and of course they had a real stake in seeing their way of life continuing. And so I think that was very, very important. And of course, these indigenous groups came from a variety of different cultures and backgrounds and so forth. And I think that was a relatively new thing for the government to be engaging these groups, because frankly, they looked down on them a little bit as sort of, illiterate and not terribly important people. But they actually found that they could learn quite a lot from these indigenous groups. So I think that was probably the more interesting engagement that we did, rather than any particular ethnic group or anything like that.
Good. Board member Steve Fisher asks, you mentioned the Paris Accord. If there is a new administration, do you think the U.S. can join again? And how long might it take to get us or them back to where we were before?
That's a great question. And that's something that, in fact, I got an email the other day from the World Resources Institute in Washington asking, they're writing a paper now for the new Biden administration, if he's elected, about how to get countries like Indonesia on board with a more ambitious pledge. And I said to them a couple things. I said, first of all, the landscape has changed a little bit just in the last year or so. One is that China itself has made a huge new pledge. Many of you may have seen at the most recent UN General Assembly, Xi Jinping, the president of China, announced a goal of seeing China peak its carbon dioxide emissions before 2030, which is a pretty interesting goal, and to reach carbon neutrality, complete carbon neutrality across the entire economy before 2060. So that's an amazing commitment if they can actually make it work. That carbon neutrality basically means that the sum of all the carbon that you put in and take out of the atmosphere should balance out to zero. And for a country that uses a lot of coal and things like that, that's a big deal. So anyway, so China's made this big commitment. The second largest is the European Union. They too have made very substantial carbon neutrality pledges, but by 2050 in their case. So really the United States is the one that has to step up now. And I believe that if we can get the three largest carbon emitters together, working together, and pushing the others to do the same, we can make some progress. Joe Biden has, of course, come up with quite an ambitious climate plan that you all have seen. And I think the major change will be whether we'll be able to work with China. The Trump administration, of course, has really portrayed China as the enemy and is really confronting them on every level. And I think that a lot of that is understandable, and we need to certainly stand up for our interests. But I think that on some issues, it is in our interest to work with China. And I think climate is one of those. And I think they'd be willing to do it. After all, it was President Obama's outreach to China before Paris that led to a lot of the very ambitious pledges that were made, the so-called nationally determined contributions that were made at the Paris climate talk. So I'm actually an optimist. This assumes that Biden wins. If Trump wins, it's going to be very, very difficult to make progress.
Okay, thank you. Layla Halal has a question. You spoke of competition and reputational risks as leverage points. Is there a limit to the change that is possible if morality is not a key motivator? And does it limit government's options? Should we give up on moral arguments? What's the balance?
Well, I don't think it's so much morality. It's more a question of their markets. So, for example, I'll just give you a very blunt example. Indonesia has been trying to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union now for years. And the last sticking point is palm oil. They want to be able to sell as much palm oil into the European market as possible. And the EU is still worried about deforestation and worried that, that there's still a lot of illegal clearing that's going on, a lot of the famous fires that are taking place. And so they're really trying to hold Indonesia's feet to the fire to get more concrete commitments that they're going to stop these things. And that has held up the entire free trade process as a result of that, much to the irritation of the Indonesian government. But good on the Europeans for doing this. So these markets really matter. And yes, they can sell more maybe to India, maybe a little bit more to China, but still the United States and the European Union are still the major markets. And so we do have considerable leverage if we choose to use it. And at least in the EU's case, they have decided to do that. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, actually, this brings up a question that I have. My company is a food importer, and several of the products we bring in from Asia have palm oil in them.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think small companies and individuals can do to push this issue.
Well, right now, again, I don't think that the Trump administration has made much of an effort on this because climate is just not that much of an issue for them or a priority. But I'm hopeful that, again, if Biden is elected as president, we'll have a more substantial policy. And I'm sure at that point that they will then be thinking about a variety of trade and other practices that can help encourage the kinds of behavioral and policy changes that we're looking for. So I think the government will give you guidance on that, and they may even be thinking about various trade sanctions of one sort or another to really enforce that and stick it in some way. I think it'll a little bit depend on the judgment that they can make about how successful they're going to be in the next big climate talks will take place next year in Glasgow. So they'll have to make a judgment about whether they think again, if we can get the three major emitters to work together, and if we can get some serious commitments out of the other countries, then maybe you don't need to resort to some of these other more draconian measures. But so I think all of that is in play, and they'll just have to make some judgments about that. But I know this is going to be a very, very important priority for the Biden administration if they are elected.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question.
Please.
Your passion for the diplomatic service comes through really strong. For the students in our audience, I wonder if you could give them some guidance on how they should prepare educationally for a possible career in the Foreign Service of the State Department.
Sure, sure. That's a great question. You know, first of all, there's no, for those of you who have gone through the SAT process and things like that, there's no study guide for the Foreign Service. I mean, the best thing I could advise you to do is to, you know, just read up as much as you can. Those of us who are in the Foreign Service, we read the Washington Post and the New York Times every day, the international section. I try to look at the Financial Times fairly regularly. I used to subscribe to Foreign Affairs. I now get it online. So, you know, try to just bathe yourself in what's going on in international relations more broadly. Of course, take courses in international affairs. And then I'd say, you know, most of the people who join the Foreign Service join in their late 20s and early 30s. So they've had some experience. Many or most have gone to graduate school. And most of the people who have joined have had some experience overseas. So that could be anything after you've graduated from college. Maybe you might want to think about the Peace Corps, or you might want to take some sort of internship with an international business. Or you might, you know, go and just find work working for an NGO overseas. Really, anything that gets you overseas and learning about foreign affairs is going to be terrific. And as I say, many people have graduate degrees in international affairs as well. It's not mandatory, but it's I think it certainly helps. So again, and there's no one pathway into the Foreign Service. People come from every kind of background that you can imagine. We actually had a sheep herder, believe it or not, in my entering class in the Foreign Service. And you know, we had another person who was a flight attendant from American Airlines. So, you know, people they get passionate about overseas and international affairs from all kinds of different backgrounds, and they all make great Foreign Service officers.
Great, thank you very much.
I should say one more thing. The Foreign Service exam, I'm now, you know, 30 some years out of date. But if you go onto the state.gov website, there's a little link about careers. And you can see there about the exam process and how it works. And again, the only advice I have there is you can take the exam as many times as you want. There's a written exam and an oral exam. And there's no shame in failing the oral exam, any of the exams. Plenty of my ambassadorial colleagues failed the exam once or twice before they actually got in. So don't be discouraged. You learn each time you take it. And again, it's one of the greatest careers in terms of both the opportunity to serve your country, but also just to make a daily difference in people's lives, which is just amazingly satisfying.
You're very passionate, and that's great. Ambassador Blake, thank you so much for this evening's presentation. We really appreciated your presence and your program, and thank you so much again. I'm going to turn it back over to Leila. And
yeah, thank you, Ambassador. I think it was really an enlightening presentation, and you gave us a lot of food for thought on a complex issue that is going to be with us for a very long time. And focus on solutions. So we thank you very much for your time.
Leila, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, please.
If there are students who are interested in the Foreign Service, I mean, feel free to give them my email, and I'm happy to talk to them and have a special little session or whatever.
That's great.
I'm very happy to do that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, IAF does have a student leadership team, and we'd love to invite you to address that team of students directly. So thank you. And thank you to our donors and members for participating tonight and for all of your generosity. You keep us vibrant and keep our community vibrant. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.